Alright, man, peace. I'm sure that many of you brothers out there are familiar with my description and my overall definition of the role pertaining to the liberal black female in this modern day Babylonian society. That being that she has three alters, or quote unquote personas per se. That being as the racialist, which is one of the favorite alters, especially of this current time period with the liberal black female, where she loves to commandeer the so-called black community and speak about racial dynamics and issues as if she's someone who is familiar with any methodology to solve problems, which they are not. The reason why the so-called liberal black woman loves to speak about race is because she knows that the racial topic is going to get the attention of the mainstream liberal media, and normally is going to ingratiate her with the liberal Caucasian that she loves so much and values for their mentorship per se. And of course, the next persona is the globalist. We see that manifests itself in the liberal black females' association with and affinity for the LGBTQ community and the way in which they try to get involved in the causes of other races. Now, I've always said that 95 to 98% of all Western or westernized so-called black women are liberal black women to some degree or in some way, shape, or form. Of course, there are different levels to being quote-unquote liberal. There are some who are extreme and some who are relatively moderate liberal black females. But in general, about 95 to 98% of all Western or westernized so-called black females are liberal in their views and in their opinions, and certainly in their outlook pertaining to how they treat themselves, their so-called community, as well as their consort, the so-called black man. And it's very pivotal that the so-called black female be imbued with and trained in the arts of racialism and globalism, because she's the main teacher of the quote-unquote black child. And for the vast majority of young so-called black boys, they have no idea what society is actually about and what reality is until they reach 30 or 35 years old, because they've been taught nothing but bullshit all the way through school that gets reinforced by that matriarchal structure within their household. And then in their 20s, they're getting involved in these illusory relationships with these random, whorish, young, liberal black females. They might even be compelled to impregnate one. And then by the time they finally start to put the pieces together, they're around 32, 34, 36 years old. Then they become very embittered about this society in general. And sometimes they'll go off into their own corner and just stew over society at large. But just getting back to the overall programming component of the liberal black female, the main persona or alter of the liberal black female is as the feminist. She has a direct alignment not only with the so-called Caucasian female, whether they want to admit it or not, but specifically with the pagan mother goddess archetypes of the Babylonian Kemetic mystery school system of lore or of old. And that is why it is so difficult to interact with or communicate with them in this current time period, because the liberal black woman wants to be the head. She wants to be the boss of everything. And she believes that every so-called black man is beneath her and certainly less intelligent than her. And it manifests itself in a myriad of ways, because at the end of the day, the so-called liberal black female is almost like an enigma that the so-called black man has to solve, like a Rubik's Cube. It's only when you understand them that you can move on to the next level, pretty much like a video game. So one of the main roles of the liberal black female in this society is to act as that distraction, as that conundrum. So she has to pump the racial rhetoric to convince the so-called black man that she's on his side, when in reality, her job is to be an obstruction between the so-called black man and addressing the heads of this society, that being the liberal Caucasian male and the other factions. But you have to move past the so-called black woman first, so she must stand in the way. So what she'll normally do is engage in double talk. She'll say things like, these white people this, or these white people that, or these white women this, or these white women that. But they take most of their core programming from the Caucasian female, specifically from the liberal or the Marxist Caucasian. So they're not really against the rulership of so-called white people, because deep down, whether they want to admit it or not, the liberal black female knows that if there were no Caucasians in this society, they would have to listen to what a so-called black man has to say, and they don't want to do that. And it's going to be brought forth in this segment right here. As we can see, it's called Previously on America's Bullshit. This is a very tacky and obnoxious segment that was created by a couple of very tacky and obnoxious, quickly expiring older liberal black females in Jemele Hill and Cari Champion, who have probably the most toxic and annoying show on television, but it's great as a backdrop. I want brothers to pay very close attention to the doublespeak that they use in trying to speak about Mr. Chad Wheeler, the former offensive lineman of the Seattle Seahawks, who found himself embroiled in a domestic violence situation with his live-in so-called black girlfriend. Watch how Cari Champion and Jemele Hill try to navigate these waters of having to castigate their quote-unquote white knight, because there's a difference in how they address the so-called Caucasian male when he's with a so-called black female, because deep down in their programming, the liberal black female seeks after an open-minded so-called Caucasian man to be her consort. That is her dream. That's why if you pay very close attention, you'll notice that what resonates the most with many younger liberal so-called black females is the relationship between Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Why is that? It's because of what Prince Harry represents. An open-minded, or at least in their view, an open-minded so-called Caucasian male of high status who actually wants to be with what is told to the public to be a so-called black woman, even though Meghan Markle is not a so-called black woman. Her father's a so-called Caucasian man, but it still serves as an appropriate device to supplement the fantasies of the liberal black female, the subconscious fantasies that she has. And I just want brothers to pay very close attention to how Jemele Hill and Cari Champion report on the Chad Wheeler case and how they speak in double talk. They speak out of both sides of their mouths. So, of course, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
So as we head towards Super Bowl Sunday, the NFL has a lot to talk about, not necessarily just on the field, but also off the field.
Yeah, there's a major reason why people are discussing what's going on in the NFL, and it's beyond the game, as you said, because Seahawks lineman Chad Wheeler pleaded not guilty to domestic violence charges. Now, I think we should start the conversation by listening to a clip from two-time Super Bowl champion, a friend of ours, Chris Long's.
Now, brothers, pay very close attention. This person here, Jemele Hill, she couldn't wait to rush to a clip from a liberal Caucasian man, Chris Long, because she's using him as a chess piece to try to nullify so-called black men who are probably all up in her DMs and on her social media asking her when is she going to speak about what happened with Chad Wheeler and his quote-unquote black girlfriend, knowing that that is the weakness of the liberal black female. In the same way that certain superheroes have a weakness for sunlight or water, the liberal black female has a weakness for Caucasian males with black women. They don't like to talk about those relationships at all because subconsciously that is their dream relationship. So the first thing that Jemele Hill is going to do is try to hide behind the empty rhetoric of a liberal Caucasian male by the name of Chris Long, who is Howie Long's son. Chris Long is one of these, athletes who tries to act as if he's trying to save the world. He goes to Kenya and Somalia and these other places in Africa trying to dig wells as if he's going to be the one involved with trying to save the world. A lot of these people that you see on television who do that, they're actually Luciferians, and they have a double role when they head overseas. They're acting as if they're trying to aid the Aboriginal or indigenous populations, when in reality they're being sent there by the government to interact with a connect overseas pertaining to a particular issue that needs to be handled. So always keep your eyes on someone like a Chris Long or someone else who you find is always in the news for being in Africa or in Southeast Asia, acting as if they're trying to help the indigenous population. For example, you have the actress Angelina Jolie, who's the daughter of the actor Jon Voight. You also have Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, particularly Matt Damon, who always found himself in Haiti for some reason. It would not surprise me if Matt Damon is involved in child sex trafficking involving Haitian children. Of course, everything that I'm saying is alleged. In regards to Angelina Jolie, her father, Jon Voight, always plays CIA agents in movies. Would it surprise me if he actually is an agent in real life who's been embedded into Hollywood? It would not surprise me one bit. Especially when I see some of the open avenues that are given or that were given to Angelina Jolie back in the 2000s. Well, she was just an actress, but she's meeting with all of these dignitaries and things of that sort, and always up in Africa. Madonna also. So a lot of high-level witches and sorcerers are given access to children from overseas because they know that for the most part, those children are not going to be missed. But, just getting back to the point, it just amazed me. As soon as this person, Jemele Hill, read the story, she wanted to run and hide behind Chris Long. Let's hear what Chris Long has to say which is the reason why Jemele Hill wants to hide behind him, because they're both in concert trying to deflect everything that Chad Wheeler did back onto the so-called black male athlete,
who had this to say on his podcast, Green Light, and talking about the hypocritical reaction to Wheeler's charges.
What we can decide.
Let me say this very quickly before Chris Long speaks. The name of his podcast, Green Light, is an allusion to the heart chakra, which I believe is the quote-unquote green chakra. Now, if I remember correctly, Beyonce had a song called Green Light back in the day.
To do today as a league is hold our peers accountable. And guess what? It's not always going to be as easy as it was this week. I saw a lot of dudes unloading the clip on Twitter, as they should, on Chad Wheeler. Bold tweets. Haven't heard a word from them when it's their teammate or somebody they know or a peer or somebody popular in the league.
So in other words, what Chris Long did right there in a very shrewd way was call out many of the more prominent black simps in the NFL who were trying to act like they were putting down a hard line on what Chad Wheeler did, when many of their popular teammates have done, acts along those lines to nowhere near the severity, but, in the same class, and none of them said anything. That was a very, very shrewd thing that Chris Long did to deflect away from Chad Wheeler as a so-called Caucasian and back onto the so-called black male athlete. That's why Jemele Hill wanted to use that little soundbite first to introduce what she wanted to touch on, that being the quote-unquote hypocrisy of the so-called black man, and wanting her to speak about Chad Wheeler, but not wanting to castigate people like Tyreek Hill or Antonio Brown or what have you. So as usual, the liberal black female, when her feet are put to the fire, will always side with her liberal Caucasian overlord. Always.
Begin with the media double standard.
The reality is we have to all realize that there is generally a double standard with black athletes whenever they are accused of a crime, convicted of a crime. Their transgressions are not only front and center in the media, they're talked about and brought up over and over and over again.
Well, it's a little bit more severe than that. Most of the so-called transgressions of white Caucasian or so-called Caucasian athletes, whatever you want to call them, males, are not even reported. Many times, they're not even brought up on charges. It's just, you guys settle down. When the police officer opens the door and recognizes that so-called Caucasian male athlete as someone who's notable, they say, hey guys, calm it down, and they'll pull the Caucasian male athlete to the side and say, look, this is going to look very bad for you if you keep this going. I won't talk about it if you don't, but you can't keep going on with this because eventually it's going to be brought to the public. With the so-called black male athlete, he's removed from the home. The wife or girlfriend is spoken to as if she's the head of the household. She wants her boyfriend or husband to be brought up on charges. The so-called boyfriend or husband, who himself is a very prominent athlete in the NFL or NBA, is taken to the precinct. He's fingerprinted. They take the mugshot. Then they go call up TMZ and they say, hey, look, let me tell you guys who we have here in our custody is so-and-so. And that's how it transpires for the so-called black athlete, in contrast to what occurs with the so-called Caucasian athlete. The Giants had a punter who had something like 25 or 30 domestic violence incidents with his wife, and it almost never made SportsCenter at all. And they keep using the excuse, well, the position that he plays is not as prominent. When it's a black male athlete, they're more prominent. Get out of here. There was a linebacker who wasn't even like a main line or a high-level performer for the Washington Redskins, who they kept talking about being involved in a domestic violence situation just last year. I think Reuben Foster, whatever his name is. So this this attempt to create a digression or an illusion or an obstacle to get into the point of the difference in how the media covers when a so-called black male athlete gets into a domestic violence disturbance as opposed to a so-called Caucasian athlete. I mean, it's just not necessary to act as if there's no difference or as if the difference is not severe. That's why I always state that, in my view, the so-called black male athlete should not even be married until he leaves the NFL or leaves the NBA. And when you interact with the females that you choose to interact with, you have to make sure that you're on your P's and Q's, because they are out here to try to get you, bottom line. And when they cover you on television, centuries like this, who are trying to front like they're for their people, but they're actually for white liberalism, you're going to see their true colors show. Look at how reticent they are to speak about Chad Wheeler over the course of this segment to address it in a real or a substantive way.
People are still bringing up all the things with Michael Vick, right? Even though he served his time.
He's paid the price.
Yes, and even more so than a lot of people. Same thing for Ray Rice. Like, he's been about the work. So, of course, there's a double standard. However, that being said,
now the reason why she prefaced her statement with all of that about Ray Rice and Michael Vick is because this is what she really wants to get to right here. When she said, that being said, that was her admission that all of that stuff was just fluff to cover up for her real sentiment. So let's hear what she has to say here.
I mean, let's be real. Who knew Chad Wheeler's name before this happened? Nobody.
Right, but why does that matter, though? If you guys are trying to stomp out domestic violence in professional sports because domestic violence in professional sports is reflective of what's going on in everyday American life, why should it make a difference how prominent he is as a player, especially in light of how severe his attack was on that young female?
Backup offensive tackle, I believe. Like,
yeah, we're talking about a backup offensive lineman, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, he's in a nameless position, and he's not a name. That has a big reason to do with why you did not see the same level of attention.
So let the record show that depending on your role on the football team, that should have a direct correlation with how bad you're allowed to beat the shit out of your woman. That's precedent that they just established right there. So we have to pay very close attention just in case there's some second stringer, playing backup linebacker or backup right guard who happens to be so-called black. If he gets into a domestic disturbance with his wife, let's pay very close attention to how much the media harps on what he did and for how long. Because I promise you, if James Johnson, the backup right tackle for the Arizona Cardinals, were to beat his woman, especially if his woman were to be a so-called Caucasian female, to within an inch of her life, and say to her, wow, I'm surprised you're alive, like this person did right here, you would never hear the end of it in the media. That would lead every show from First Take to Undisputed to Sports Center for a week. No doubt about it.
Two things that bothered me, because this is the double standard of being black versus being white.
This person, Cari Champion, is trying so hard to use the race topic to keep herself relevant. And you could tell that she was never really about that action until the last year or so, because whenever she speaks about it, it's totally out of context and it sounds completely contrived.
The fact that he wasn't charged with attempted murder bothers me. This man is 6'7", 300 some odd pounds, and he was pounding on a young girl. I don't care if she was black or white.
That's interesting. So you said that what you were offended by and what you deemed the double standard to be racially is that he was not charged with attempted murder, but you don't care whether the girl was black or white. So you don't think that that had an impact on what he was charged with. You don't think that had his girlfriend been white, that the judge may have considered raising the charge to attempted murder. So it's very clear to me, Cari Champion, that despite how hard you try, you still don't understand what the term double standard means, especially racially. Because I assure you, I'm not saying that he would have been charged with attempted murder had his consort been a so-called Caucasian female, but the chances certainly would have been higher. But let's get to the nitty-gritty. The real reason why you're saying that you don't care whether or not his woman was white or black is because it goes against your programming. Subconsciously, you were happy to see a so-called black female in a relationship with a so-called white man. So you're not going to address that aspect of the case. And neither will Jemele Hill, of course. They're just going to talk about Chad Wheeler in and of himself. They're not going to talk about what he did to a so-called black woman, because they only want to attack the so-called black man when it comes to domestic violence situations against a black woman. So there's so many layers and levels to the mentality and the programming of the modern day liberal black female, and why she says what she says and when she says it.
Domestic violence is a real issue. I also don't want to hear about his manic episode as an excuse. That too bothers me. That is that double standard where there's already an excuse put inside for this man.
Yes, similar to how you guys use the excuse of how you don't want football players to address him when they're not addressing their own teammates. That sounds like an excuse to keep a lot of the vitriol that was being sent his way away from him.
Chris Long talked about this, about how I saw a lot of NFL players reacting, saying, like, that dude's in my locker room, I would do this. That dude's been in your locker room before, and you know what you did? Say nothing, but he's a great teammate and a great leader, and he needs to be forgiven. The thing is, if you're so outraged by domestic violence, then you should have a problem with watching the Super Bowl, because there are players playing this weekend who have this on their record.
Here, start making.
So what you're saying is that Tyreek Hill and Antonio Brown have on their record that they beat a woman or tried to beat a woman to death and actually told her that they were surprised that she was still alive. You're comparing Tyreek Hill and Antonio Brown to this guy, Chad Wheeler. That's a desperate act of a liberal black female once again trying to cover for her overlord. And of course, look, it's very nuanced. So many people might not see it or understand it, but that's what the liberal black female has been set up to do, especially liberal black females in prominence. Whether it's Jemele Hill, Cari Champion, Oprah Winfrey, or whoever that you see on television who's allowed to speak and give their opinion. Their job, and it's not just the woman. These so-called liberal black males the same way, the Roland Martins and, a lot of these clown-ass boule members. Their job is to get on television and act as if they're against quote-unquote Caucasian racism, when in reality their job is to protect the king. The king is the image of the so-called white man. Bottom line. That's why at the end of these liberal Negroes' racial diatribes, they always end in, when are we all going to come together and unify as a world? They don't say these things about the so-called Caucasian and end it with, when are so-called black people going to come together as a nation of people and under what banner? Because that's not their intention. Their intention is to be foot soldiers for what's known as the quote-unquote New World Order.
I'm just saying, and I don't see nobody saying anything about that.
You know what? I'm about to go on your DMs and tell you agent for the white man. I don't want to hear that.
Well, that goes without being said. We already know what she is, the same as you.
You gonna sit up here and make sense.
Cari, that's my brand. Caping for white men.
Yeah.
That's basically what you do. You tried to cover for it with your fake anti-Donald Trump rhetoric. But then somehow you came up with this situation or this scenario where you would have to sleep with Donald Trump to save the world. Now, who would come up with some silly shit like that other than someone who subconsciously wants to sleep with someone? Why would that even occur to you? I mean, come on. That doesn't make any sense.
Yes. You gonna sit up here and make sense?
Yes.
How dare I? Shut your mouth.
Look.
So that's basically it on that, brothers. I just wanted to once again highlight the true mentality and many of the tactics that are used by the liberal black female to hide any attempt at bringing culpability to actual perpetrators and do what they normally do, which is deflect it back on so-called black men. It's a tactic that they use quite often and very well, to be honest with you. And that's why it's so important that brothers understand these tactics, how to nullify them or offset them, and as usual, put the Most High first. So peace.